We're going to start lesson 7, which is going to have us adding and subtracting decimals by looking at some place value and rounding. So just a couple of reminders. When we have a decimal, anything that's before it is called a whole number. And that whole number, you can just, if you're trying to find place value, you can kind of ignore everything that's after the decimal point and just look at this number when finding your places. So the number that, the place that the 8 is in would be the thousands place. The 7 is the hundreds. The 6 is in the tens place, and the 5 is in the ones place. So the ones is always right next to that decimal. Now, I know that some people kind of have a hard time with decimal place value, and what I like to do with decimal place value is I pretend that the decimal point itself is a 1. There's no ones place with decimals, like there's a ones place on the left side. There's not on the right side. So I like to pretend in my head that the decimal point is kind of the ones place. Now, if I'm trying to find which place the 4 is in, I'm going to have that 1 underneath my decimal point, and I'm going to attach a 0 since it's one place after the decimal point. This creates the number 10. That tells me the 4 is in the tenths place. Anything after the decimal point has to have a THS at the end of it. I'm going to repeat this for the rest of the numbers. So since the 3 is 2 places after the decimal, I'm going to put 2 zeros after that one, which creates a 100. So this is the hundredths place. Notice the THS at the end. I'll attach another 0 for the 2, which creates 1,000 or the thousandths place, again with the THS on the end. And then one more 0 for the 1, which creates the number 10,000. So this is the 10,000ths place. Again, with the THS on the end. So before decimal, no THS on the end. After the decimal, THS on the end. A little review of decimal rounding here. We are going to take this decimal right here and round it to certain places. So we're going to start with the tenths place. In order to round to the nearest tenth, we have to go one place further than that. Everything before stays the same. And then I'm going to take my decimal out one past the place I'm rounding. So this is my tenths place right here. So I need to go to the hundredths place or one more. This digit is going to tell your tenths place what to do. If this number, the one that you're using to round, is 0 through 4, it tells the number next to it to stay the same. If it's a 5 through a 9, it tells it to go up 1. So since this is a 4, it's telling the 6 to stay. So if I rounded to the nearest tenth, this would be 54.6. I drop everything after the place I'm rounding to in a decimal situation, and everything else to the left of it stays the same. So if we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, I'm going to go one place further out than the hundredths place, which would be the thousandths place. So I'm going to write this number out over here. I'm using the number in the thousandths place to round the number in the hundredths place. In this case, the 8 is in this situation, and it tells it to go up 1. So the 54.6 stays the same, and then the 8 tells the 4 to go up 1, and it becomes a 5. To round to the nearest thousandth, I need to go to the 10,000ths place, so it's the entire number written out. The 7 is going to tell the 8 what to do, and since 7 falls in here, it's going to tell the 8 to go up 1. So this becomes 54.649. If you're asked to round to the nearest whole number, that means that you should look at the digit next to the decimal place to see what to round to. So I'm using the tenths place to round the number in the ones place. In this case, the 6 tells the 4 to go up 1 and round it to the nearest whole number. It would be 55. Okay, so just a quick little review with that information. And now we're going to get into sums and differences of decimals. And just a reminder, a sum is the answer to an addition problem, and a difference is the answer to a subtraction problem. Now, you may be looking at this and seeing that the title says the sum and differences of decimals, but we're looking at fractions. Well, we're going to actually use fractions to do this. So notice the directions at the top say to convert each fraction into a decimal, then add or subtract, and not to use a calculator. So this is going to be a little different than you're used to. We are going to start by looking at the whole numbers in the problem. So with number 1, I have a 25 as my whole number here, and 376 as my whole number here. Since I'm adding these two together, I'm actually going to flip the order, which the commutative property tells us that's okay to do if we're adding, just to have the longer whole number on top. So I'm going to actually write this with my whole numbers lined up. Now I have to change my fractions into decimals. So I'm just going to ignore the whole number piece and look at the fraction right now. So I've got 3 tenths and I've got 77 hundredths. When changing a fraction into a decimal, I look at the denominator first and I say, is the denominator a decimal place value? So is there a tenths place? There is. So what this is saying is I need a 3 to finish up or wind up in the tenths place. So what that looks like is a decimal point with the 3 right after it. Typically I would put a place saver 0 here, but I'm actually attaching this to the whole number, so it would actually be the 25 in front of it. So 25 and 3 tenths can look like a fraction, 3 over 10, or it can be 0.3. So next to the 25, I'm going to attach 0.3 or 3 tenths. Now, I'm going to look at the next one. Is there a hundredths place in decimal place value? There is. So that means I need 77 to end in the hundredths place, which would be 0.77. Goes out to the hundredths place. So next to the 376, I'm going to place my decimal, and I'm going to also be careful to make sure my decimal points are lined up, and then put my 7. If there are any holes, as I like to call them, after the decimal point, I'm going to fill any of them with zeros. So if you'll notice there's a hole right here, I'm going to place a 0 there. The next step in adding two decimals together is to bring the decimal point straight down into your answer, and then you can just ignore it and just add as though these were two whole numbers. So 7 plus 0 is 7, 7 plus 3 is 10, so I'll put the 0 down and bring over my 1. 6 plus 5 is 11, plus 1 more makes 12. 7 plus 2 is 9, plus 1 more is 10, and 1 plus 3 is 4. So that would be my final answer in decimals. I'm going to do the same thing for the next problem. I'm going to look at the whole numbers first, 426 and 275. This is a subtraction problem, so the numbers have to stay in that order. I don't have a commutative property with subtraction, so I just have to line them up, the 426 and the 275, as though I were subtracting them as the whole numbers that they are. Now I have to look at the fractional part. I'm going to change each one of these into a decimal. So again, I'm going to ask myself, is there a fifths place in decimal place value? There is not. So what I'm going to do next is I am going to see if I can change this fraction into a fraction with a decimal place value in its denominator. So if you recall, the place directly next to the decimal is the tenths place. So I'm going to think, can I turn 5 into 10? And I absolutely can. So I'm going to turn this into a fraction over 10. So 5 times 2 is 10. 1 times 2 is 2. 2 tenths is the same thing as a 2 in the tens place, or 0.2. So next to the 426, I'm going to put 0.2. I'm going to do the same thing down here. There's no halves place. I'm going to change this into tenths, since 2 does go equally into 10. 2 times 5 is 10. 1 times 5 is 5. 5 tenths is the same thing as a 5 in the tenths place, or 0.5. Okay, I am now going to do the same idea that I did with the adding. I'm going to pull my decimal point straight down into my answer, and I'm going to subtract as though it weren't even there. So I can't do 2 minus 5. I'll take from the 6 and just make sure that I am subtracting correctly to get my answer. Okay, let's look at one challenge type problem. This one says to actually use your calculator. So this is one where we will allow the calculator to be used. I'm just going to pull mine out so it's set and ready to go. So it says use a calculator to convert the fractions into decimals before calculating the sum or difference. Round your answer to the nearest hundredth. This is going to be important when we look at those decimals that we're getting. So it says Razel wants to determine how much gasoline he and his wife use in a month. He calculated that he used 78 1/3 gallons of gas last month. Razel's wife used 41 3/8 gallons of gas last month. How much total gas did Razel and his wife use last month? So we're trying to find how much they used together. So we're going to be adding 78 1/3 plus 41 3/8. We want to turn these both into fractions, or into decimals. I'm going to start by lining up the whole numbers just as I did before, and I know there's going to be a decimal after them, so I'm going to put that decimal point there. So I want to remind you that every fraction is a division problem. So 1/3 is actually 1 divided by 3. 3/8 is actually 3 divided by 8. So that's how we're going to turn these into decimals. So in our calculator, if we do 1 divided by 3, we get a long repeating decimal with 3's. So since it asked us to round our answer to the nearest hundredth, and we know to round our answer to the nearest hundredth, we would need to be one place past that, we're going to round this answer to the nearest thousandth. So in order to do that, we would look at the 10,000ths place. This 3 tells this 3 to stay the same, and it would be 0.333. So next to the 78, I'm going to put 333. So I'll do the same thing for the next one. 3 divided by 8. And this one works out nicely to 0.375. And I'll attach that here. Pull your decimal straight down and start adding. It did tell us to round our answer to the nearest hundredth. So I'm going to take the 8 and use that to round the 0. That means it would go up to 71 hundredths, and this is gallons. So they used 119 71 hundredths of a gallon of gas this month, or last month.